Okay, it's the penultimate session of today. It's been, for those of us who've been, hi. It's been a long day in here. So, we shift focus to look at wildlife and then at animal welfare. This session is going to run for an hour, looking at better wildlife tourism and addressing the question whose responsibility it is. Going to ask Colin Bell to speak first. I hope to be fairly provocative from a Southern African perspective. Then we're going to go on to hear from Sandra Carver, who's from UNWTO, Jeff Manchester from Intrepid, and then from Mohammad Rafiq talking about an interesting collection of properties and their views about wildlife tourism. So Colin, if I may, I'll ask you to start, and if I can make the technology work, we'll have a presentation from you. I think Colin probably wins the prize today for having the most extraordinary photographs.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. The graveyard shift. Everybody says you must never talk at this time. We'll try. We've got a very interesting topic, and it's all about our wild places and whether they will survive the modern new world we live in, and whether they can match the economic benefits which are going to start pouring through from this new age we live in. I'm going to talk mainly about Africa, but it also applies to anywhere else in the world. And really the problem is the tourism industry has done such an incredible job. You're buying the drinks. Who's it? There we go. You can take off from London and overnight, and next day you're watching lions in a nanosecond. The travel industry has done such an extraordinary job making it so easy. Anything you want, anywhere in the world, the travel industry gets you there. And you start to believe, actually, there's no problem. We always hear about the seas and how the seas have been so exploited and full of plastic. And yet, one overnight flight, and you can be in the most crystal clear waters in the world. What's the problem? And I think part of the problem is the tourism industry, because it's so good, has numbed us to the real effects of what's happening out there. If you want to see elephants, no problems. Off you go. But what we're starting to see now is a little bit of press coming through. Since we started this talk, one elephant has died. Every 15 minutes, bang. Every 8 hours, a rhino goes. We're now starting to breed less elephants per year than are being killed. But the problem is, in the tourism industry, you arrive, everything looks fantastic. You're at the front, you're in the front seats, you're seeing the most extraordinary experiences. And it's only when you scratch, and you scratch gently on the veneer, and you start to see behind what the tourism industry can shield you from, and you start to see the problems, the poaching, the extraordinary wildlife losses throughout Africa. I don't know if you saw the latest London Zoo stats, which are coming out saying in the last 40 years we've lost something like 52% of all our wildlife around the world, and we've lost something like 76% of all our sea life. And I think this particular two images sums it all up. Have a look at the top left. This was taken the 26th of March, 12:51. Two rhinos walking past a camera trap in Kruger Park. Have a look at the next pic. Same day, 26th of March, 1:57. Same rocks. It's pity it's so bright here. Can we just turn down the lights? There we go. I'll go back one if I can. No, let's keep going. The same spot, 3 of the poachers coming through. 1 carrying water and the panga, 2 with rifles. 1 hour later, 2 rhinos gone. Every 8 hours, this is happening. Bang, bang, bang. And the story about rhinos in the 80s and the early 90s was all about Chinese pharmacopoeia and the Yemenis with their jambaya daggers. That was stopped in 1994. We had 14 golden years of rhinos. And then the Vietnamese and the criminal syndicates got hold of it, first for a potential cure for cancer. And if you imagine you've got cancer, you'll grab anything. Then, once the cancer bogus was destroyed, it became morphed into jewelry. The latest thing now, 1 ounce of rhino horn costs $100. 1 kilogram is 100,000 kilograms. It's double the price of gold. It's more valuable than cocaine. So what's happened is now we're getting criminal syndicates who are exploiting poor people who are living right next to our reserves. And all the way through Africa, you find this. You find this. The tourism industry is kind of built on the last 40 years. But the question is whether the tourism industry and the wildlife industry will sustain the next 40 years. And that's the question we've got to ask ourselves. Because all these people who live around our parks, many are impoverished and will be only too happy to go over the fence and poach an elephant or a rhino to put food on their tables. And I guess the problem we've got, if you look at this map, only 7% of Africa is set aside formally for wildlife protection. And around that, these parks are becoming more and more densely populated. And unless we solve the issue and the relationship between people and parks and wildlife, we will not have a wildlife industry in the next 2 decades. And have a look at this picture. People are now living in amongst the wildlife. They have livestock in amongst the wildlife. And when you get the clashes between the old world and the natural world, there are going to be casualties. And wildlife is the casualty. And it's now morphed onto militia. And this is the biggest single threat we've had in the recent while. And if you look at what's happening around Africa, Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Lord's Resistance Army, how do they fund their activities and how do they put food in their soldiers' bellies? And it's now coming through wildlife, in particular elephants. Last year, 30 to 35,000 elephants were poached. And that's mainly criminal syndicates working in cahoots with the militia. We solved the piracy problem of Somalia. They lost that source of revenue. They're now focusing it on elephants. Every 15 minutes. By the time Manch is talking, another one. And off we go. But it's not only that kind of problem. We've got a tourism industry which does some incredible things. And this is a good and a news story and a bad news story. The tourism industry is also one of our prime destroyers. Some of the crass practices which the tourist industry does helps to become the prime destroyer. And going forward into the future, we've got to make a decision as a tourism industry. Are we going to be the savior or are we going to be the destroyer? This type of practice doesn't work. And so many local people are now getting absolutely dismayed with the prospects of tourism ever delivering for them, that they're now starting to put maize. This is the Masai Mara. They're starting to grow, wheat in the Masai Mara because they feel they can get a more regular source of income from wheat than from wildlife. What a tragedy. And then you have governments making stupid decisions, putting a highway through the Serengeti. I mean, if this ever happens, that's the end of the migration. But you can understand why governments make silly decisions, because there are more beneficial economic opportunities out there which will get them votes to be voted in next time. And one of the biggest single problems we've got is money laundering, where the country which is hosting the tourists is not getting the benefits from tourism. The money ends up in the Isle of Man or in some Guernsey or Swiss bank account, and it doesn't end up in the country which is hosting. This is one of the single biggest tragedies, and it's one of the absolute things we have to rectify as a travel industry now. Otherwise, we will not have a wildlife and a wilderness out there for us to enjoy. And have a look at this slide. I sort of do everything in my own life. I'm now a little bit more than 50. I hit 60 the other day. But 60 years ago, there were 450,000 lions in Africa. Today, 20 to 25,000. In my life, in our lives. What's going to be happening with the next generation? 445,000 tigers to about 3,000, 3,400. Cheetahs, everything is on this massive downward trend. And we have to then make a decision as a tourism industry. Are we going to be part of the success going forward? Or are we going to be part of the problem? And are we going to continue the poor ways we've been behaving in the past? As a tourism industry, we do some incredible things, but as a tourism industry, we do some poor things. One of the things we have to do is we have to celebrate the folks who do good. The most important thing is if we can get back the tourist operators which are now putting more land under formal conservation. If we can go from the 7% to 14%, imagine what they can do. So as a tourism industry, we must be supporting anybody who's now putting more land under conservation. And there's some huge success stories. I'm talking about the poor, but let's talk about the good stories. Take, for instance, Namibia. 25% of Namibia is now formally under community conservancy protection. Add that to the 18%. There's something like 43% of the entire country is formally conserved through a partnership between the tourism industry, wildlife, government, and NGOs. A huge success story. Take, for instance, some of the wildlife populations in the desert. 20, 30 years ago, there was something like 1,000 springbok in the whole of northern Namibia. Today, it's hundreds of thousands up in the Kokaveld area. Desert elephants up. Black rhinos surviving out in the middle of nowhere. The Okavango Delta, same story, Botswana. 40% of Botswana is set aside formally for wildlife, but only 17% is formally in national parks. The balance is in what they call WMAs, wildlife management areas, where the communities get 6% of all the turnover. And as a result, 60% of everybody around the Okavango, 45% in northern Botswana is employed through wildlife. They are the best protectors, and that's why wildlife and rhinos are being moved back into Botswana from South Africa. Rwanda, fantastic success story. Years and years, charcoal was being hauled out of these forests. Now, it's the home for the gorillas. And they're almost at the maximum carrying capacity. And there's some extraordinary individuals. There's this guy called Rod Cassidy, who's up in the Central African Republic. Now, you remember a year ago, there was a huge coup in this particular dam. And this is called a Bae, Zanga Bae. The militia came in, the rebels came in, shot hundreds of elephants. Rod Cassidy went back up to his little lodge called Sanga Lodge. This guy single-handedly dealt with the rebels. One guy in the tourism industry. The NGOs were gone. Everybody was out of there. Rod Cassidy was in there, dealt with the militia, dealt with the rebels, got them to move 60 kilometers north. The tourism industry can be the best protector. Can be the worst destroyer, can be the best protector. Take, for instance, Pamashana, Southeast Zim. They feed 20,000 people every single day. 20,000 kids who would otherwise be starving. They've got one of the highest rhino populations in the world, and they have zero poaching. Why? Because they look after their neighbors. And the same thing they've done in the Serengeti. They've secured the Grimiti area. And it's this discussion with people and wildlife and bringing the people into the tourism industries, which is going to be crucial. And we're starting to see it now in Kenya. Kenya is now starting to come together with these conservancies. Individuals are starting to create their own whole anti-poaching stories. There's the wonderful story coming out of certain products in the tourism industry, and we need to support those because we've got a choice. We either see living gorillas surviving, or we're going to have them in the cooking pots. Tourism, and each and every one of us has got to make a decision. Do we support good tourism, or do we support bad tourism? Is a dolphin worth more alive or in a cooking pot? For most people in Africa, it's worth more in a cooking pot because we're not delivering. And look what this tourism industry does. I think that sometimes this type of tourism is as much damage as that fellow who's killed the dolphins. We've got a situation now, I'm going to give you two examples, then I'll finish off. Lion petting. If anybody ever puts a single guest into a lion petting facility, you should not be able to sleep at night. It's a fantastic story. Go to TripAdvisor. Lion petting, fantastic. Come pet the lions. But they're part of a process. When these young lions are in a petting zoo, they're in the process of being monitorized from the moment they're born to the moment they die. The first thing is petting. Then they bring volunteers in. Volunteers pay. This particular place has got 24 volunteers paying $1,000 per week. They make $100,000 just from the volunteers coming to do good in Africa. All they're doing is they're making sure that these lions make money for their owners. From here, they become trophy animals. And once they finish with being trophy animals, they go to the bone trade, sold to China as tiger bones. And we've got to be careful. What do we support? Mancha's going to talk about elephants. Do we want lions to be free and wild, or do we want them to be part of the petting zoo to be slaughtered? There's a good story. And the good story is the great whites. Around South Africa, there's two main big sort of islands filled with seals, and the great whites hang around them. And there's a couple of dive operators who are given licenses, and you can go out with these folks. They put a cage down the side, and you can go and watch great whites. To see great whites so close, where you're not really impacting on the behavior, is putting respect of sharks into people's minds. And we're starting to see a whole shark network and a whole shark family coming about because of the good work of these folks. And I love this little one. You've probably seen it on the internet. This is the world's most dangerous animal in the world. It is responsible for millions of deaths every year. By its side, a great white shark swims peacefully. Now, the tourism industry, this is our message. Do we still remain as the most dangerous animal on the planet? Or do we go and mend our ways? Do we get rid of the generators? Do we become green? Do we get rid of the plastic water bottles in our lodges? There's no need for generators. We can run everything solar. Each and every travel company should be putting aside a portion of their finances for wildlife preservation. Otherwise, we will not have a wildlife industry for our grandkids to see. And we will not have a travel industry which is going to be based on the wilderness. Yvon Chouinard started this with his Patagonia, 1% for the planet. And I think every travel company should be starting to do this to make sure that the money can then be going to really worthy causes. Because we've got problems. And this is the good news story. This is the challenge for the tourism industry. Tourism can be the best conservator. Without tourists paying decent amounts of money, going to the right areas, paying the right cash, supporting the good operators, we won't have conservation. And there's a very famous saying which says, conservation without cash is conversation. And that's what tourism can do. Tourism can be the best conservator. And folks, please remember this thing. We're seeing a lot of people are backing off booking Africa. Just remember this thing. We are closer to the source of Ebola than Nairobi is, than Johannesburg is, than Gaborone is, than Okavango is, than Cape Town. We are closer to Ebola right now. We don't have Ebola in Africa where the wildlife is. Do not let petty Fox News prejudices destroy what the wildlife industry depends on. And that's a viable tourism industry. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. I expect that tomorrow when you're being grilled by Stephen Sackur, that phrase, conservation without cash is mere conversation, may well occur again. Be very surprised if it doesn't. Sandra, I will in a minute get your presentation up. Please come and give us your view. Best to use the space bar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oops, I'm trying to destroy technology before I start. My name is Sandra Carver. I'm in charge of communications at the World Tourism Organization, and it's a pleasure. Harold, thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share with you the preliminary results of a study that we've conducted on the economic value of wildlife, and I think it comes very adequate to the conversation we were having and how to transform that into conservation. The study actually started exactly a year ago when we started to see a huge increase in the issue of poaching, and we started to say, okay, how can tourism, international community back the efforts that are being done? What arguments do we need to actually start this conversation? And we decided to go the economic way and say, okay, what we need is hard facts to actually prove the value of wildlife tourism in Africa to the African countries, to the communities, and bring that as our advocacy evidence-based argument. So this is the origin of this study, more or less a while ago. As you know, probably one of the best arguments is when you come with hard data. But when you talk about Africa, unfortunately, that is still very complicated. How do you come with the economic value of wildlife tourism when even in terms of measuring the value of tourism itself, we're still struggling so much? So our approach was, first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about wildlife watching tourism? And here here's the definition that we used for the study. We're talking about non-consumptive forms of wildlife-based activities, as observing and sometimes touching, not in the same way that Colin was mentioning, the animals. What we did basically is surveyed our constituency, the Ministers of Tourism, National Tourism Administrations, wildlife conservation authorities, but also tour operators on the ground and in the source markets to try and see, can we actually have a figure that shows the value of wildlife tourism in Africa? And this, I can tell you, is probably one of the hardest areas to make any assessment. We had around 48 governmental institutions from 31 countries contributing to the research, and around 148 tour operators in 31 different countries. You can see Europe, Africa, and others, mostly source markets in Europe, obviously, and incoming in Africa. And these are some of the results that came out of the report. Obviously, everyone agreed that national parks, nature, and wildlife are the key assets of wildlife watching destinations in Africa, that there are benefits spread throughout the whole value chain of tourism, but much beyond, especially in terms of local providers, which sometimes are not associated directly with tourism, and that actually wildlife tourism is one of the biggest sources of employment in tourism. We also tried to identify what kind of wildlife watching was offered mostly, and safaris and bird watching actually came out as the more common activities offered. And in terms of services included in wildlife watching tours, because we wanted to see the ramifications on the ground, actually, as you can see, most of them were in terms of accommodation and tour guides, which is very important when we're talking about community engagement, because this is where actually the tour guides and the community can make a difference, also in educating the visitors, which sometimes need a little bit of help in that respect. Coming with all the data together, this is the results of the research. The average length of wildlife watching tours is around 10 days, so a significant length of stay when you compare with other types of tourism. The average tour price is around $433 per person, and the out-of-pocket spending is, unfortunately, as you can see, very small, $55 per person. And this comes again, what Colin was mentioning before, how much of the money actually stays in the community. So this is probably one of the major challenges that we face when we look at this data. We also wanted to see what is the involvement in terms of the protected areas, but also of the tourism authorities and tour operators in anti-poaching measures or awareness raising. The majority of protected authorities, protected area authorities are involved in anti-poaching measures. Tourism authorities are involved to a minor extent, and this is where there's a long way to go still. And this is one of the objectives of the study, to actually raise awareness in the countries that this can only be fought if there is a multi-governmental approach to it, if the different government portfolios are working together, and tourism needs to be part of this. We also realized that most of the tourism authorities does not disseminate information on poaching, and that only future operators inform their customers proactively about it. So I think there's clearly two ways here, public and private sector, to work together, not only in fighting poaching, but also in raising awareness of what is happening. Our recommendations is, as I said, first of all, we need more data. Evidence-based advocacy is impossible if data is not available. The second area as a consequence is we need to work with protected areas management to actually make sure that that data can be collected and used, because if we're going to make the case of the benefit of wildlife, we actually need to have that data available, and to actually support the involvement of tourism, public and private sector in terms of conservation. Just to finish, I'd like to share with you a campaign we launched last year at ITB. We launched it with Marriott and with Sabre. It is a campaign aimed at awareness raise at the tourist level, not the intermediaries. What we want to tell each and every person traveling is we talk about government responsibility, we talk about industry responsibility, but we often don't talk about each person's responsibility. And this is what this campaign is addressed as. It's called Your Actions Count, Travel, Don't Traffic. It covers different areas of trafficking, from wildlife to artifacts, cultural artifacts, to human trafficking. But what we wanted to really say is each of us is responsible for actions, and we can actually make a difference if we take that stand. We've done it in partnership with UNESCO and with partnership with the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and 2 private sector companies, Marriott and Sabre. And we are at this moment enlarging this initiative to other private sector companies that want to join us. It's very easy. You just need to become a partner and disseminate this message and use it to reach your consumers. And this is what we're doing in terms of wildlife. It basically, the principle is, did you know this is happening? Here are the hard facts. What can you actually do in that respect? So in sum, this is what I wanted to share with you. I think we're still a long way of understanding the real economic value of this important sector to Africa. But our objective was really, especially at national level, to say it's not just an issue of fighting crime. It's also an issue that this crime is jeopardizing millions of people's lives that depend on tourism. And this is what we wanted to achieve with this study. And once it's available, we hope that can be useful for all the players in this area. Thank you.
Sandra, thank you very much. And as I think you know, but not everybody here may know, the trafficking issue is coming up tomorrow afternoon in the child protection debate as well. We have someone from Heathrow Airport who's involved in that, who come in to talk to us. So, our next speaker is Jeff Manchester, who many of you will know from Intrepid Travel. We'll talk about the things that you've been doing for wildlife.
Thanks, Harold. Hi, everyone.
Use the space bar.
Sorry?
Use the space bar. That's the same.
Move on. So, hands up who's ever been elephant riding? Come on, hands up, hands up. Yeah, yep. Lots of you. And look, I've been elephant riding too. It's great fun. Mind you, I find it much more rewarding to walk alongside an elephant than I do hanging on for dear life 4 metres above the ground. Look, but if you've ridden an elephant, there's no need to feel guilty. Many people have done the same, and people who aren't aware of the issues around elephant riding. Animals and tourism have had a long association. And really, you should only feel guilty if you are aware of the facts, but you choose to ignore them. And hopefully today you can be learning new facts about animals and tourism and making better choices in the future. Elephants have been used by man for thousands of years in the past, but mostly they're taken from the wild. Elephants have never been domesticated like horses and dogs have been. This is the reality behind elephant riding. Known in Thailand as pajan, it is the process of crushing an elephant's spirit. I was thinking of showing you a video about this, but it's very traumatic and half of you would walk out or be in tears, I'm sure. Young elephants are poached from the wild after their mothers have been shot. Then they're put into a tiny corral for up to a week where they are unable to move. They're not given any food or water, and they're tortured, literally tortured with sharp implements until they lose all resistance to their handlers. It's this knowledge that gave Intrepid that spurred us on to decide to become the first tour operator to cease elephant riding. At Intrepid, we've always travelled in a style that we believe to be sustainable. We use local public transport, we stay in small, locally owned accommodation, and we eat in local restaurants. We're probably the first company in the world to have a responsible tourism department, and we see it as part of our role to educate our travellers and our staff on the potential downsides of tourism. When we first started Intrepid, my business partner Darryl Wade and I thought that if we were going to make our living from taking people to developing countries, then we should give back something to those countries. We always felt a strong responsibility to the local communities, especially those that we were visiting. As we grew and began to talk about responsible travel, we found that our travellers loved being educated about issues. They became engaged with many of the causes we address, and they trust what we do. Our travellers are passionate about wildlife, and they expect us to take a leadership position. As part of Intrepid's philosophy of giving back to the areas we visit, in 2002 we created the Intrepid Foundation. This foundation collects money from our travellers and Intrepid and supports 50 small charitable organisations around the world. A number of these are animal-based charities, including World Animal Protection. In 2010, the Intrepid Foundation supported World Animal Protection in some research into the use of wild animals in tourism in Asia. The researcher, a veterinarian with expertise in elephants, visited 118 establishments in Asia. Of these venues, 97% were either inadequate or severely inadequate in the way they treated the animals. Only 4 venues were found to be acceptable. At the inadequate venues, elephants are not treated well, to put it mildly. They're overworked, they're held under chain to limit their freedom of movement, they're kept on concrete surfaces, they're not allowed to socialise and form family groups, and often not given appropriate diet and the time to eat the food that they need to eat. In the wild, elephants have complex social structures which do not exist in captivity. And many of the elephants in captivity exhibit post-traumatic stress type symptoms. As well as carrying humans, the elephants are forced into other dangerous activities, like playing football, riding tricycles, or walking on tightropes. These activities may seem benign, but the training methods are cruel, and the elephants are actually coerced into undertaking them. And some of them are just plain dangerous for such a large animal. So it was with this knowledge, there was no way that we could continue to include elephant riding in our trips. So over a 3-year period, we gradually removed elephant riding from all our itineraries. At first, we did not know what impact this would have on our trips. Some people in the company said, gosh, no one will want to go on our trips whatsoever. And other people were saying, look, we've just got to do this no matter what. And like any other organisation, there was a huge array of opinions. However, our research of our own travellers found that while elephant riding is valued, it's not one of the major 2 or 3 reasons that people would choose to travel with Intrepid or choose a particular itinerary. Like all issues, it's not one that can be solved easily. While it was the right decision for Intrepid to stop offering elephant riding, it could cause huge issues if it was completely banned immediately. Elephants are very expensive animals to look after. If elephant riding was stopped immediately, there would be thousands of elephants and mahouts suddenly unemployed. Elephants would be abandoned or killed, and many families left without an income. So really, alternative employment needs to be found for elephants and their owners and keepers. We also need to consider the cultural sensitivities in the countries where elephants exist. They have, in some places, they have important religious or cultural significance. We see our role as helping to reduce the demand for elephant riding. While there's demand, someone will always provide supply. We want to educate our travellers and other tour operators that the use of elephants in tourism needs to change. We've been publicising this through the media and our own social media. Recently, I took a group of journalists to Thailand for them to see firsthand what some of the alternatives to elephant riding are. Our travellers have taken very positively to the discussion. We've actually had more social media activity on the elephant issue than any other issue that we've ever discussed. Our experience is that when people are educated about an issue, they really want to do the right thing. So while we might lose some travellers who really do want to do elephant riding, we're greatly adding to people's positive outlook towards the Intrepid brand. So from that view, I'd really strongly encourage other tour operators to make the same move. We also want other tour operators to understand the issue, who are willing to take a stand, importantly, to know that there are other alternatives. Alternatives like the Elephant Nature Park north of Chiang Mai in Thailand. I was there recently and it is the most amazing place to visit. Rather than just riding for an elephant for an hour or two, you go there for a whole day, you feed the elephants, you can bathe the elephants, you walk around the farm, effectively what it is, learning about each individual and what trauma they've been through and why, how they came to exist there. For the elephants, they just have an idyllic lifestyle. They can live in family groups, they get well looked after, and as a tourist, you come away with much more appreciation of an interaction with elephants than you would if you were just elephant riding. Of course, poaching, cruelty and overwork are not the only issues affecting elephants. Loss of habitat is a huge issue. But if we're to have wild animals in captivity, then we really do have an ethical challenge to lead change and promote education and understanding around the issue so that it can be addressed and not be an issue in the long term. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I'm sure there'll be some questions, but it's also a good link to the last session today in here, which will be on animal welfare and tourism. But the final speaker for this panel is Mohammad Rafiq, who's going to be talking about the organisation that he represents, the Long Run Initiative, which has, I think, is still funded by the Zeitz Foundation. So, Rafiq, over to you.
Harold, thank you very much. Foremost for the opportunity to be here with all of you and to my colleagues with whom I'm sharing this panel. My presentation today complements what my colleague just presented. It's not as alarmist. It's not hair-raising as their presentations were, which rightly so. I have looked into this today from a broader perspective of the overall issue of wildlife weaving, the problem it entails, and what can or should be done about it. And also it's tailored more by my optimism, which has always kept me company, that we as individuals and institutions, as businesses, have both the opportunity and the ability to do things right, and that we can indeed do things better than we seem to be doing. Begin with, I'm not assuming that everybody knows what Zeitz Foundation and Long Run is, so I would take a few minutes just to put that in perspective for you, and then I'll go into the issue of the problem and what the good practice might be. Zeitz Foundation was founded in 2009 by the businessman Jochen Zeitz, who was the chairman of Puma at that time, served there for a long time, very inspired by Africa, and took early retirement and decided to put a chunk of his wealth into conservation. And the whole idea is that the world in which we live, that it is maintained in the healthiest state, with major contribution to this health coming from people making sustainable choices. And then the mission of it, I'm just looking for my glasses here. Okay, to create and support sustainable and ecologically, socially responsible projects. But the crux of it is that it is built on what is called the 4 C's of conservation, community, culture, and commerce. And that is the relationship. And it is a bit departure. Those of you who have been involved in the sustainability debate, people have talked about economy, environment, and society as the 3 pillars. To this, the aspect of culture has been consciously added because it tends to be buried under the social dimension of sustainability. But also it has made the economic link more explicit, where the basic premise is that unless conservation pays for itself, it cannot compete with other land uses. Conservation on ethical ground alone, honestly, has very little future. We have seen it in the past 2 decades, more protected areas and less biodiversity. And unless the conservation begins to pay, its future will remain uncertain. Zayed Foundation has 2 components. One is called the Long Run Initiative. One is the Laikipia program. Laikipia program is like a research laboratory which works around Segera Resort in Kenya, where some of the ideas are tested. And the Long Run is the international program through which they are magnified and replicated. The Long Run Initiative itself, it's spread across different parts of the world, mostly in the tropical world. And it brings together leaders who are keen to meaningfully contribute through responsible enterprise and investment to global sustainability. It is built on 2 pillars. One is the standard, which is called Global Ecosphere Retreat, and the other is membership. And the members are 3 different types of members. They are long-run supporter, and then long-run alliance member, and then GER, as we call them. They are those destinations which are accredited to the standard itself. I can talk a lot about it, but that's not the time and intention. But let me say just one thing, that it is different than any other standard in the tourism industry, where the standard is based on all standards. You can take any one of them, and they end how well a property is managed. Whereas in this standard, how well a property is managed is a means. It's not the end. The end is to conserve these pristine environments for posterity and for sustaining the livelihoods of the people. And therefore, any destination or any hotel or anything, unless they own or influence significant landscape and seascapes or investing in their conservation, they cannot become a member. So a 300-bed hotel in downtown Nairobi cannot be a member. A 5-room facility influencing 1,000 acres of freshwater lake are most welcome in this group. So the full focus is on conservation and posterity. We have grown over the past 5 years, I would say, quite a bit. And it makes me very proud to stand up here and say that, today we have 40 long supporters, 28 alliance members, 12 credited destinations. And between them, they either own or influence 12 million acres in conservation. And it's not insignificant. Coming to the issue of the topic. Wildlife viewing is a privilege, and truly. all of us as children would remember running after butterflies and wanting to catch them and touch them, and how fascinated it was. And even at 60 years, we can't escape the awe of seeing a lion out there. It's very human. So it's truly a privilege to be able to do that. And it worries me personally that how much my children would have to make an effort to be able to do what I was able to do. It's becoming harder and harder ever. But it also has other benefits, which is education and awareness. So it's not really a bad story that wildlife viewing is taking place. In fact, it's a good story in many ways, and my colleagues have alluded to it already. You know, it helps in educating and raising awareness about the issues. It raises money for the conservation itself, which desperately needs more money out there. It is helping local economies, it's promoting international trade, and it's also contributing to peace and conflict mitigation. The problems are many, but I categorize them into 5. There are threats to wildlife itself, the disorientation and associated negative behavioral changes, feeding, breeding, watering, crossing, giving birth, everything is affected when they are exposed to external stimulus. Nesting birds, illegal collection of plants and animals, off-road driving, harassment and crowding of animals. And the list goes on, you know, to habitat pollutions, to pathogens, to predation, to use of as baits. And this is my worst example. I was once in Chetwan National Park as a visitor, and I found it extremely gross that they would use a monkey and hang it off a tree so that you could see a Bengal tiger. And this is wildlife viewing. So you are doing, I can't even describe how sad it was in many, many ways. You know, it's just is one manifestation of how, if you're not careful, you can do so much harm. And then there are threats to human life itself. Life can be at risk, but diseases, and we all know that between gorillas and humans, there are diseases which are common, which can spread back and forth, and also there is risk to property. When animals become habituated, they come to the village, and they share your crops. It's not limited to what they do out there. And then, you know, the production systems. And the most of all for me is that the whole experience of seeing nature, the originality of it, the organic nature of it is diluted. It's not quite the same. The question that Hal asks was whose responsibility to it? It's everybody's responsibility, but most of all, it's the responsibility of the tourism industry. And sometimes the industry hides behind saying, we don't consume nature, we live with nature. But if you go and peel this onion, then you find that the industry is not really always internalizing the full cost of what the products that they are offering. So there is a responsibility there. They need to better internalize the cost of using nature, striking a balance between profit, prudence, and posterity, and as probably Harold would say, is in the spirit of responsible tourism enterprise. There is a lot more known about the bad practice, and we have listed all of them. You have heard a lot about it. Towards good practice, there is also a lot available. And most of it takes cue from the wildlife research, which the scientists have done. There are 2 issues with it. One is that this guidance is fragmented. So you have some elephants on rhinos, some guidance on lions, but it's in piecemeal. And second, it's not implemented. These are the 2 key issues as far as the good practice is concerned. And I just tried to use some examples from the member destinations of the Long Run Initiative here, you know, how they are doing. This is Suniva Fushi, where they are, you know, a marine island in Maldives. and they are putting $20,000 a year into this Biotal Biosphere Reserve just to protect that. In Cayman, in Brazil, they have undertaken a 2-year project to understand the behavior of the animal so that it can be viewed in a responsible way. In Segura, I was with the owner, and the person came, ranger, and said, last night 2 of the livestock have been killed. And he smiled, he said, well, it's a cost of doing business. So you have to be prepared to internalize the cost of the wildlife products that you're offering out there. Again, there are many, many examples that we can quote. The basic message that I want to leave you with is a lot of guidance is already out there. It's available. And it's being followed as well. Going forward, and this is my last slide here, that if it was occasional incidental viewing one was concerned about, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is really when it is commercially driven, because that is where the issues of cost and benefits and profits come in. There are opportunities in existing standards. As I said, the first thing is we should not look for more guidance and say until we have more guidance we can't do anything. Go ahead and do and follow what's available, and then capture the fragmented guidance in a holistic approach, and then do some applied research to fill the gap. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Rafiq. We've had 4 really good presentations. I want to go straight to the floor for questions. Who's going to go first? Valère here, please.